Welcome back to Creative Excuses, where we make excuses to be creative out of the video games that we play. Today, the excuse is ESO, and I am desperate to get this build video out before they release account-wide achievements, so here we go. I've got a new idea on how I want these build videos to go, so instead of me just telling you the build, I'm going to put the full written build in the description, so if all you want is a set, gear, and ability list, boom. Check the video description and reference it to your heart's content. The reason I'm doing this is that I want these videos to encourage you to be creative just like I'm trying to be. So instead of just going over the build, I'm going to give you the same build challenge that I gave myself, and then I'm going to show you how I solve the problems that the build idea presented. So let's jump into it. The first thing I choose when giving myself a new build is the theme. Sometimes this is something like a phrase, maybe it's Arcane Archer or Ultimate Dragon Knight or Edgelord. Other times, like today, it's a gameplay concept. Maybe it's I want a bow build, or I want a simple bar build, or I want a healer, I want a hybrid build, etc. For today's build, I wanted two things, a hybrid build and a one bar build. And a third bonus thing, I wanted a Necromancer because I hadn't made one yet. So that's the challenge for you guys. Make yourself a hybrid one bar build. You don't have to make it a Necromancer. Instead, make it out of whatever class you play the least. Push yourself to learn a new class and try out a completely new playstyle. I don't care if the build is a solo build, but it probably shouldn't be a tank for this challenge because most tanks are already hybrid builds of some sort. So make it a hybrid one bar, healer, DPS, or solo build. Now, if you're a stat nerd listening to this video right now, you probably realize there are some significant problems with making a hybrid one bar build. At least there were when I made the build. The Ascending Tide patch that comes out in just a couple days will make this kind of build quite a bit easier, I think. But for now, what are the problems that I ran into with this build? There are four main problems that I want to show you how I solved. There's probably more, but these are the big ones. The first one is the access to major buffs that any build needs. Something like Major Berserk, Major Sorcery for extra weapon and spell damage, Major Savagery and Prophecy for the extra crit chance. This is a pretty big problem because Necromancers do not have access to any of these major buffs in their class kit. So I have to get them from potions, from skills, or from armor sets. I looked at my options to get them from skills, and before the Ascending Tide DLC, the options were slim. I could run Degeneration for Major Sorcery, I could run Rally for Major Brutality, and a nice burst heal. I could run Camo Hunter for Major Savagery and Inner Light for Major Prophecy. That left me with one slot for a spammable aura damage over time, or for Blast Bones. That's a pretty crap idea. If I used potions for either the Stamina or Magicka buff set, I would still lose 2 ability slots to get the matching buffs for the other resource, so that was still a pretty crap idea. So I solved this first problem with sets. I chose to run the combination of Rattlecage and either Toothrow or Treasure Hunter. Using these two sets, I would get all 4 buffs and only sacrifice 1 5-piece bonus to get the buffs, because each of these sets gives that major buff and its other resource counterpart, along with half of a 5-piece bonus. When you're this limited, the combination is actually fairly effective and very stat efficient. Second major problem, damage. Hybrid builds before the Ascending Tide DLC could definitely put out a good bit of damage, but there's a reason you don't see one bar hybrid builds running around all the time. They just weren't good. Luckily, Necromancers can put out a ton of damage on their own, which made this build a bit easier. The only problem for me is that I hate Blast Bones even more than I hate the Shulk's ability. At least when you use the Shulks from the Warden class, you get that satisfying thunk sound when your character punches the ground. But when you're a Necromancer and you use Blast Bones, there's basically no noticeable feedback, so it just feels like absolute mush. It just goes whoosh as you lift your hand. And that just isn't satisfying. So screw Blast Bones. But the Necromancer is built around that skill, so by getting rid of that, I took out a huge chunk of my possible damage. That meant that I needed to pick some other really overpowered skills, which for a Necromancer means enter damage over time skills. Necromancers get a 15% increase in damage to damage over time skills specifically, so I just needed to stack my bar with those. First up, Unnerving Boneyard, because it gives extra penetration, and that on a solo build, as mine was, is almost always a good thing. And it fits the Necromancer theme really well. Obviously, it's a boneyard. Boneyard, it's a graveyard. Next up was Stampede, one of the best dots in the game, dealing almost as much damage as Unnerving Boneyard. Sticking with the two-hander, I picked up Carve for the really strong dot, and a really strong defensive tool because of its shield. Even with the upcoming mild nerfs to Stampede and Carve, I am keeping them on the build. They're still really strong, they'll just play a little bit differently. Last, I picked up the Skeletal Arcanist for its AoE damage and super satisfying animation where it just lobs a big ball of lightning at the enemies. For my ultimate, you're probably thinking I chose Pestilent or Glacial Colossus, but that actually didn't work. My damage wasn't high enough for the major vulnerability window to be useful because major vuln is a percent-based boost. That means the higher your damage, the more valuable it is. 10% extra damage when you're dealing 100k DPS gives you 10k extra damage. But at 15k DPS, you're only going to get an extra 1,500, which is not nothing, but it's really not great. Instead, I went with Flawless Dawnbreaker for the passive bonus damage, the much cheaper cost, the good buff uptime, and because it basically deals the same damage as the Necromancer ability. It's not as cool as the Colossus, but it is definitely better for this build. And we'll get to our last ability in just a second. The third problem I hit while making this build was healing. Originally, I wanted to avoid using the Ring of the Pale Order for an extra challenge, so I used Intensive Mender, which is a super cheap and really strong heal. The problem is that it was my only heal, which meant that if I got bursted down inside the 2-second window between heals, I died. And I died a lot. The healing was really strong, but it just wasn't quite enough and wasn't consistent enough. And I couldn't figure out a defensive monster set that I could combine with it to carry me. On top of that, I had to replace the Skeletal Arcanist with Intensive Mender, which made the rotation way more frantic because of the timers on the two abilities, and it just didn't feel as good anymore. I also wasn't using Blast Bones, so I couldn't always rely on having a corpse for Braided Tether or Mortal Coil, so I used the Ring of the Pale Order instead. Sure, it's a crutch, but it's a really nice crutch. Combining the Ring of the Pale Order with the occasional Carve was just enough healing to get the job done for veteran Vateshran Hollows, except for one boss where I used Ring of the Pale Order and Intensive Mender as a backup bar just for that fight. But I didn't use both bars at the same time. I still stuck to one bar. The final problem I had to overcome once I figured out the healing situation was sustain. You see, I was trying a bunch of different spammables. I tried the super dope Scythe AoE spammable and heal from the Necro skills. It was super cool and fun to play with, but it was so stamina hungry that I had to heavy attack a ton to keep it up, which was bad both defensively and offensively. So then I tried Wrecking Blow from the two-hander skill line. It was cheaper and hit like a truck, but even with recovery and cost reduction glyphs, I just couldn't sustain it. Part of that is I'm lazy and I don't have medicinal use, which would be helpful, but whatever. I was also playing a Dark Elf, which doesn't have a sustained passive in the traditional sense, but I was using Toothrow where I could on the body armor pieces, and an infused Rattlecage mace with a stamina sustain glyph, and it still wasn't enough to sustain either of those spammables. Basically, every spammable ability I used didn't work and left me heavy attacking or unable to block or roll dodge. But then I had an absurd idea. This Necromancer was primarily a solo build, and I test my solo builds not in Vet DLC dungeons, not in single target fights, but in veteran Vateshran Hollows. And what does that arena have? A crap ton of adds with fairly small health pools compared to bosses. So what if, just what if I tried Reverse Slice as a spammable? What? No, that would never work. Would it? It worked. It totally worked. Because Reverse Slice has a lower cost than a normal spammable, I could spam it without nearly as much issue and almost never run out of stamina. Unless I was dumb and had to roll dodge a lot. Not only that, but the splash damage from Reverse Slice enabled a whole new style of combat. Instead of focusing the boss and AoEing everything down, I had to focus on the adds and use the jacked up execute splash damage to hit the boss harder. And it worked. I couldn't believe it myself, but it did. It took practice and a new way of thinking about fights, but it worked. I got a no-death run of Veteran Vadashran on the build and was only a minute and a half off of a trifecta with it. I was so excited. This is one of my favorite builds, which I never thought I would say about a Necromancer, but it is super fun. And with the changes coming up in the next patch, this build will be even stronger because we can stack up all stamina instead of splitting our resources between Magicka and stamina. Sustain might become an issue again with the changes to Reverse Slice, but that's okay. I've got room to grow just by picking up the medicinal use passive, which I have heard, again, makes a massive difference. Alright everyone, that is the build challenge, and those are the problems and my solutions for them. Now I want to hear about your builds in the comments, so go out there and challenge yourself to be creative. Make your own 1-bar hybrid build, and when you finish it, post it below. I want to hear what role you made the build for, what sets you used, what skills you used, and how you tested the build. Did you use it in a trial? Did you use it on world bosses? Did you use it for just soloing overworld stuff? Just let us know what it is, that way we can know what the purpose of the build is, so we can choose whether to use it or not. Remember, the full build is written down below in the description for you to reference, and you can always check out the stream at twitch.tv/creativeexcuses. With that, I'll catch you all in the next excuse.